All right, we are going to dive into ecology a little deeper with this e-learning lesson. This is kind of building on the previous 2 days of lessons on what I called energy transfer, day 1 and day 2. We learned some basics in those, and now we're going to dive a little bit more deeply. Just take a look here at the objective today as far as what we're going to learn, and the first thing is going to be the symbiotic relationships. We're going to review the 3 symbiotic relationships that we need to know: mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. I just wanted to give you a couple more good examples of those. We kind of glossed over them, but want to make sure that you've got a very clear understanding of those. We're then going to talk about feeding methods. All right, for feeding methods, remember, if we take a look at a fish and we take a look at a person here that eats the fish, please don't laugh at my drawings. If we have a line from the fish to the person, remember that just shows us that the fish is transferring. We're getting our energy transferred from the fish to the human. Remembering that with feeding methods, we're talking about the flow of energy with our arrows, and we'll be diving into that more deeply. We'll also be talking about energy pyramids and the 10% rule. And then finally, we'll wrap up today with the biogeochemical cycles and the main things that we need to know from the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. For ecology, we need to know the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. So we'll be talking about the water cycle at a later date. Before we dive into symbiosis, though, I want to make sure that we're all up to date on what I'm expecting of you from these e-learning lectures. These can be a valuable tool, mainly because you're able to pause and rewind when necessary, so keep that in mind. Really helps you to go at your own pace, whereas in class you may be hesitant to raise your hand, or even if we were learning together on a Zoom link or a Zoom lesson, you might be more hesitant to raise your hand. Here you can just pause, rewind. Any questions that you have, though, remember you can shoot me a message on Canvas, or if you're brick and mortar, or even on e-learning, you can bring those questions up when we're meeting on Zoom or when we're meeting face-to-face in class. Make sure you're taking notes in your written notebooks just like you would be in class, and make sure your cell phones and all your other devices are away. This is a part of the personal ownership, obviously, of an e-learning environment. You do have to take ownership of that, all right, to make sure that you're getting everything out of these lessons as possible. All right, so like I said, there's going to be 3 types of symbiotic relationships that we're going to be talking about. And we've looked at these briefly in class, but I just want to make sure that you have a clear understanding by focusing on some examples. The first example is mutualism, or the first type is mutualism, and our big example there is the sea anemone and the clownfish. So sea anemones, they have these powerful stinging tentacles. You can see them kind of coming off of our little picture here of our sea anemone. And those powerful stinging tentacles, they're toxic to most sea creatures, but not all. And that's where this mutualistic relationship comes in. A lot of you have seen Finding Nemo, and you've seen him. He's a clownfish, okay? So anemones, they've developed a type of a symbiotic relationship here known as mutualism, where these 2 animals, okay, the clownfish and the sea anemone, are both going to benefit in some way, shape, or form, all right? For the clownfish and the anemone, of course, we see shelter being one of the main things. So the anemone provides shelter and protection for the clownfish, and in return, well, the clownfish is able to kind of help keep the anemone clean, all right? And it also helps to lure prey, because prey will follow the clownfish and say, oh, there's a tasty treat, and then the clownfish goes into the anemone where it's safe. However, the other organism might not be resistant to that toxin. So that's our first example. It's mutualism. Our second example, it's a different one. It's commensalism. We have one species that's going to definitely see a benefit, and then another one that's really unaffected for the most part. And barnacles and whales are a great example of this, because what we see is that the barnacles actually feed by attaching themselves to a whale's belly or to its back. This allows the species then to eat microorganisms as the whale swims. All right, so it kind of creates like a little cleaning station for the whale. So it provides that service. So what we're seeing is a situation where only one of the species really benefits, and the other one, doesn't really cause any harm. to the other, and there's really no justifiable benefit. The third one, which is an obvious one, that would be a parasite or a parasitism, right? So if you have a dog at home, you got a fluffy little puppy, that fluffy little puppy needs to be on some type of a heartworm medication. Heartworm is something that would be a parasite. Ticks, obviously, would be an example of a parasite. They feed off of the blood of organisms. So that is the parasitism. COVID-19 is a virus, right? That's another example of parasitism. So these are the three main symbiotic relationships I want you guys to be aware of. Please make sure you've added the example of the anemone and the clownfish to mutualism, the whale and the barnacle to commensalism, and the dog and the tick to parasitism in your written notebooks. Okay, moving now into new material, we're going to talk about feeding methods. And when we talk about feeding methods, When we talk about feeding methods, we're talking about specifically how an organism acquires its energy. Well, remember, we have producers and we have consumers, right? The producers are able to create organic material or organic molecules known as glucose from the sun, but other consumers, and that's what we're going to be looking at, other consumers, they're going to actually have to consume something, obviously. We're going to focus on three types of feeding methods, so we're going to go ahead and draw this chart in our notes. The first type are the autotrophs, then the heterotrophs, and the decomposers. You can go and pause and make sure you copy this down first. All right, so for an autotroph, it's very simple. So the word auto means self, and troph means feeder, because that's why we are talking about feeding methods, right? So basically trophic methods. All right, so it's a self-feeder. A heterotroph is something that requires something else to obtain its energy. Hetero means other, and again, troph means feeder. All right, and then for decomposers, a decomposer is something that's going to fit into any specific trophic level, and in a little bit here we're going to take a look at energy pyramids and we'll see how that works. All right, so we'll get into those here shortly. First, let's take a look at the autotrophs. All right, there's going to be two big groups of autotrophs. The first one are going to be what we call the chemoautotrophs or chemoautotrophy. And the other one is going to be called photoautotrophy or autotrophs. The chemoautotrophs, these are going to be the deep sea bacteria. And deep sea bacteria are able to obtain energy actually without sunlight, and that's what makes them so unique. With these that is so incredibly unique is that these chemosynthetic bacteria, they live in the deep ocean vents around the hydrothermal vents, and then compounds like hydrogen sulfide and things of that nature will flow out of the vents from the Earth's interior, and they're then used by the bacteria for energy to make food. And then the photoautotrophs, those are the ones that we more readily know, and those are just our regular green plants. So those are going to be, for the most part, our producers. All right. Okay, over here for the heterotrophs, we've already done our activities on this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, and we've discussed these in class, but we've got our herbivores, our omnivores. All right, herbivores, as we know, plants only. Omnivores eat both, like bears, and carnivores are meat only. For decomposers, we're going to break them down into two separate groups. I'm just going to move the arrows there for the sake of space. The first group is going to be what we call a detrivore, and the second group is a saprotroph. So in those two groups again, the detrivores and the saprotrophs. The easy way to remember the difference between these two is that a detrivore is going to ingest first and digest second. All right, ingest first, digest second. For example, like a vulture, right? A vulture is a decomposer, but first it actually ingests the dead organic material, and then it will digest the dead organic material. Okay, so what decomposers do is they break down, oops, sorry about that, they break down dead organic material. So both of these categories are going to do that, right? However, one of them is going to ingest it first, the other is going to actually digest it first. So that is where we find ourselves with a saprotroph. A saprotroph is going to first digest, and second, it's going to ingest. I'm going to take a moment, pause the video, try to think of an example of an organism that would fit into this category. All right, very good. So for this one, we are going to have as an example, the main example is going to be a mushroom. All right, so we've got our two types of decomposers, the detrivores and the saprotrophs. On now to our energy pyramids, and I want you to take a moment and try and brainstorm yourself and write down in your written notebooks, why is it a pyramid? All right, so make a little note of that real quick. Why is it a pyramid? So hopefully you're able to come up with, well, the obvious one is the idea that as we move up the pyramid, all right, the amount of energy declines. That's going to be the first reason. The second reason is going to be as we move up the pyramid, the number of organisms is going to decline in each level or each trophic pyramid. All right, so here at the bottom we have our producers, okay, and the producers are getting their energy directly from the sun. We're going to say that the producers have approximately 100% of the sun's energy. Of course, that's not exact, but that is our 10% rule. All right, so let's write out our 10% rule. First of all, basically just saying that only 10% of the energy from the previous trophic level is passed on to the next trophic level. So if our producers down here have 10%, go ahead and pause the video and take a moment and fill in how much energy are we going to find by percentage at the herbivore level, at the omnivore level, and then at the top at the carnivore level. Take a moment and do that. You should also have drawn this energy pyramid in your written notebook, so take a moment and do that. All right, so we should have that the herbivores are going to make up 10%, or they'll have 10% of that available energy that the plants and the autotrophs and the producers passed on. All right, and then the omnivore group is going to have 1%, and then the carnivore group is going to have 0.1%. Now that we've talked about the feeding methods as well as an introduction to the energy pyramid, I'd like you to take a moment and please label each one of these levels by what type of feeding method the organisms in these labels have, referring to the notes that we just took on feeding methods. All right, so we see that we have in the producer group the autotrophs, which means that they're getting food from themselves, basically. All right, so we've got all of this in order from the bottom to the top, and we understand, hopefully at this point, the 10% rule. Now we're going to start to take a look at the biogeochemical cycles. And first of all, let's take a look at this big fancy word, biogeochemical. All right, and the first part, bio, obviously means life or biology. So we see that. Geo is going to deal with geology or the earth itself. And then chemical is going to be dealing with the chemistry in these processes. There are 3 cycles that we are going to be learning. The first 2 that we're going to look at today. All right, so the 3 cycles, again, that we're going to be looking at are the carbon cycle, the water cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. The carbon and the nitrogen are the 2 that we're going to be looking at today. And the primary focus when we're looking at biogeochemical cycles are the differences between the reservoirs and the processes, or how the reservoirs relate to the processes. So first, let's talk about what we mean by a reservoir in terms of a biogeochemical cycle. And for that, we're talking about basically it's a holding area for carbon. And then the process is basically how the carbon moves from one area or reservoir to another. All right. So for example, some examples of reservoirs that we're going to see in the carbon cycle would be like plants. A plant has a bunch of carbon. Animals as well have a bunch of carbon. So we got plants and animals. And then the processes, we're going to see things like combustion, where we burn carbon, right? The feeding methods that we've already learned about today, those are examples of processes or examples of ways that carbon is going to be passed from one to another, okay? Then in class, we're going to dive into these reservoirs and processes more. If you're brick and mortar, if you're e-learning, we'll dive into them together on Zoom in our next class, as we'll dive into those along with the water cycle.